Lateral spinothalamic tract is the one which is involved in lateral medullary syndrome. Contralateral pain and temperature are gone. Then you also have the spinal trigeminal nucleus which is located in the part of this lateral medullary part only. But unlike the lateral spinothalamic tract which is decussating, the trigeminal nucleus does not decussate. It brings pain and temperature from the ipsilateral side of the face. So that is the reason there is a loss of pain and temperature on the ipsilateral side from the face in the lateral medullary syndrome. Then the nucleus ambiguus, which is the common motor nucleus for both the vagus nerve, that is the nerve 10, and the glossopharyngeal. For them the common motor nucleus is nucleus ambiguus. So it become affected, and always what is the rule? Cranial nerves lesions will cause, nuclear lesions will cause ipsilateral paralysis. So that is anyway, for the dysphagia, hoarseness, there is no ipsilateral contralateral. So you have dysphagia, hoarseness, gag reflex, everything will typically be appearing. Then there is a vestibular nucleus which is also located in the lateral part of the medulla. That is the reason there is a vertigo, diplopia, nystagmus and vomiting sensation. Then you have the descending sympathetic fibers which are passing towards the lateral part of the medulla. From where are these sympathetic fibers are coming from, doctor? From the level of the hypothalamus. They typically pass through the brainstem towards through the lateral medulla, and finally they reach the sympathetic ganglion which is located in the cervical cord, and from there the sympathetic innervation will come out. So there is a reason there is an ipsilateral Horner syndrome, and also the central tegmental tract is the one which is affected, and there is a reason there is a palatal myoclonus. These are all the important features. Suppose if the lesion is affecting the medial part of the medulla, then what will happen? Anyway, just before we discussed is the pyramidal tract is a part of medial or lateral? It is a part of medial part of the medulla. Only medial medullary syndrome is the one which typically leads to development of the pyramidal tract involvement is what need to be understood. What is the other name given for the medial medullary syndrome? It is also called the Dejerine syndrome, and typically it is the anterior spinal artery which supplies the medial part of the medulla. If at all, if it happen to get occluded, then the individuals will develop the medial medullary syndrome. Is there any other name given for this, doctor? It is also called alternating syndrome or hypoglossal alternating with hemiplegia syndrome. It is also called as. Now let us talk about it. What do these people will have the problem? Typically hypoglossal nerve is the one which is affected if the medial part of the medulla is affected. So that is the reason there is a weakened tongue on the affected side. Then the pyramidal tract is involved. That's the reason contralateral sides weakness, hemiplegia will also be there. And the medial lemniscus, you can see, is typically located here in the medial part of the medulla. So that is the reason, doctor, the discriminative sensations of the dorsal columns, touch, vibration, etc., they will be lost on the contralateral side. So this combination is called the medial medullary syndrome. Hemiplegia is not a feature in the case of the lateral medullary, rather it is a part of the medial medullary syndrome, and you find hypoglossal involvement, dorsal column involvement, and the pyramidal tract involvement. In the case of the medial medullary syndrome, because of the anterospinal artery involvement is what need to be remembered. Insulin resistance syndrome, what is the other name given for it? It's also called syndrome X, otherwise metabolic syndrome. So we are all vulnerable, continuously sitting in the reading room and preparing for entrance. We tend to pick up around 12 kgs like pregnancy. What is the normal pickup of weight before gestation, doctor? 12 kgs. So that much weight at least we will pick up. But we need to jog during preparation. That is the best way to beat it. So abdominal obesity with a waist circumference which is more than 102 centimeters in males and females 88 centimeters is one important indication of the metabolic syndrome, which will increase the chance of diabetes, increase the chance of stroke, and also the myocardial infarction. Triglycerides greater than 150, HDL less than 40 in male and less than 50 in female. presence of the hypertension and impaired fasting glucose, the combination is called the metabolic syndrome, is what need to be remembered. One question invariably comes on acute interstitial nephritis, doctor, we must be very sure about. Renal biopsy is considered the gold standard for the interstitial nephritis. Eosinophiliuria is one of the tests which can detect the interstitial nephritis. What is the cause for it? It can be found in the case of drug induced methicillin, etc., taking them can cause interstitial nephritis. And both the light chains and the amyloid proteins, they are all implicated in the causation of the interstitial nephritis, is what need to be remembered. Now a very important question comes. We know there is a nephrotic syndrome where there is a nephrotic range proteinuria, 2 grams, 3 grams per day of loss of protein in the urine in 24 hours. We have a nephritic picture with hematuria, hypertension, etc. developing. Now the proteinuria that you see in a case of interstitial nephritis, what kind of proteinuria do you come across? Generally it is mild to moderate. But if the interstitial nephritis is because of one particular reason, you find a nephrotic range proteinuria. Which scenario? NSAIDs, painkillers, NSAIDs leading to the development of interstitial nephritis typically lead to a severe amount of both glomerular and interstitial injury. Hence proteinuria will go to the nephrotic range. Otherwise generally mild to moderate proteinuria is the rule in the case of the interstitial nephritis, is what need to be remembered. If you happen to take a biopsy, you can see the interstitial inflammatory infiltrate containing a lot of lymphocytes and eosinophils and a tubular necrosis and cellular cast. This is the typical picture of biopsy, gold standard in case of interstitial nephritis. And the striking mononuclear inflammatory infiltrate, if you happen to take the biopsy of the kidney, is another important feature. Now let us talk about acute myeloid leukemia. What are the predisposing factors which can lead to the development of AML? Certain genetic syndromes can cause predisposition. Down syndrome, Bloom syndrome, monosomy 7, Klinefelter's, Turner's, neurofibromatosis and congenital dysmorphic RBC syndrome. So these are all some dysmorphic syndrome. These are the important causes. Dyskeratosis congenita, Schwann-Diamond syndrome, where pure red cell aplasia is a very striking feature, that also predisposes to AML. And megakaryocytic thrombocytopenic purpura, thrombocytopenia, and familial aplastic anemia, Fanconi, they are all the important risk factors for the AML. There are two classical risk factors. Radiation can predispose to AML and myelodysplasia predisposes to. Easy to remember. We have a bronchopulmonary dysplasia which becomes bronchogenic carcinoma. Cervical dysplasia which becomes cervical carcinoma. Bone marrow also can have dysplasia which is called myelodysplasia. Is myelodysplasia, myelofibrosis same? No. That's a common mistake done by a lot of people. They are not same. Dry tap of the bone marrow, marked splenomegaly, they are all the features in case of the myelofibrosis. Myelodysplasia means how do they present? Megaloblastic anemia will be there. You have given vitamin B12 with resolve. Once more patient comes back with megaloblastic anemia. So refractory megaloblastic anemia is a presentation of myelodysplastic syndrome. Whereas dry tap, marked splenomegaly, teardrop poikilocytosis, they are all the features of myelofibrosis. Myelodysplasia is a predisposing factor definitely for AML, is what need to be remembered. So you can have a hyper or a hypocellular marrow in myelodysplastic syndrome. Dysmyelopoiesis will be there and peripheral blood cytopenias will be there because in the dysplastic marrow, after the production of the blood cells, even before they leave the marrow they become destroyed, called ineffective erythropoiesis, which can lead to development of pancytopenia in a case of the myelodysplastic syndrome, is what I like to underscore to all of you. So why should bone marrow should become dysplastic? Smoking can cause bronchogenic dysplasia. HPV infection can cause cervical dysplasia. Why should bone marrow should become? It can be primary or even it can be secondary, because if you happen to give alkylating agents in the treatment of, we use for a lot of purposes alkylating agents, they can cause dysplasia of the bone marrow. Topoisomerase 2 inhibitors, which are also used as a part of the cancer chemotherapy, can cause myelodysplasia. And those who have received an autologous bone marrow transplantation also are at a risk of developing the myelodysplasia, is what we need to basically remember. If this occurs, then the erythrocytic, granulocytic, megakaryocytic, all the cell lines typically become abnormal in the case of the myelodysplastic syndrome, is what need to be remembered. Now the question is, at what level is this pre-malignant change is happening in myelodysplasia? It is considered to be a clonal disorder. Directly at the level of the bone marrow, stem cell level, basically the problem is there. And these patients will develop megaloblastic anemia, macrocytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, neutropenia, etc., etc. And there are certain chromosomal abnormalities which are associated with the myelodysplastic syndrome. We need to remember 5q, 7q, 20q, trisomy 8 and monosomy 7. They are all the part of this myelodysplastic syndrome development, is what I like to underscore to all of you. This is a typical karyotype of a patient who has got a myelodysplastic syndrome. What is so classical, doctor? Deletion of the 5q is the one which you are able to see, which is a common chromosomal abnormality which is seen in the myelodysplastic syndrome. And if you happen to take a blood film, what is very classical? A vacuolated blast, which is in a patient of refractory megaloblastic anemia, if in a peripheral smear, a vacuolated blast cell is a very important indication of an underlying myelodysplastic syndrome, is what I like to once more reinforce to you, which is a risk factor for the AML. That is the reason we came here. So everything what we read in CMDT is absolutely practiced in clinical medicine, doctor. In MD general medicine, you see every inch of Harrison, but not in MBBS, let me be very sure about. We see, but we don't get time because we have to run one posting after the other posting, right? But still in entrance, everything is tested. So that's the reason, if possible, we need to be more evidence-based students. That's the purpose of showing so many illustrations. So which are the real-time images. Now let's go to the next question. What is pulsus paradoxus? Normally whenever we have an inspiration, the pulse pressure will decrease, heart rate will increase. So what is paradox about pulsus paradoxus? Will the reverse happen? The same phenomena of the fall of the systolic blood pressure which happens normally in inspiration become a little more exaggerated, right? Then why it is paradox? The paradox is, when the systolic blood pressure falls more than 10 millimeters of mercury, that means when I am expiring air, you calculate what is systolic BP. When I am inspiring air, you calculate what is systolic BP. If the systolic BP falls more than 10 millimeters of mercury, you call it as pulsus paradoxus. Suppose if it falls a little more, then what will happen? You don't feel a pulse at all. But at the same time, heart is still beating. So this discrepancy is called paradox, where the patient is not dead, sir. After all, he has got little bronchospasm, COPD is there, relieve it. Both you can feel the pulse and also the heart. There is no paradox, right? Now, let us put it in a graphic. You have the systolic BP, let us say at the time of an inspiration, and you have calculated the systolic BP at the time of expiration. There is a discrepancy of more than 10 millimeters of mercury in the recording between expiration and inspiration. Inspiration, it is falling a little more than 10. Then it is called typically the pulsus paradoxus, is what need to be remembered. Now the question comes, why during inspiration there is a fall of the systolic BP? Systolic BP is decided by left ventricular output or right ventricular output, doctor? Left ventricular stroke volume will decide what is going to be our systolic BP. So at the time of inspiration, our intrathoracic pressure becomes negative, and that will increase the systemic venous return. It will suck the blood from the peripheral veins into the thorax, and at the same time typically the intrathoracic pressure typically will go into a negative value, and that will cause the pulmonary veins to become dilated and increase the pulmonary venous capacitance, their ability to hold the blood without vomiting into the heart. And that is the reason when the pulmonary capacitance, because of their venodilatation, because of the negative intrathoracic pressure become increased, there is a pooling of the blood which occurs into the pulmonary vasculature. And pulmonary veins drain into which part of the heart, doctor? Left side or right side? Left side. So that will cause the left atrium to have less blood, because blood is remaining in the dilated pulmonary veins. So naturally that will decrease the filling of left ventricle, that will decrease the left ventricular output, and that lead to development of a reduced stroke volume, and that will lead to a fall of the systolic BP. And whenever the stroke volume falls, what will happen as a compensation? Heart rate will increase. So there is a rise of the heart rate with a fall of the stroke volume and the systolic BP because of a decreased left ventricular filling, because of a decreased left atrial filling, because the pulmonary veins are not vomiting into the left atrium and they are containing the blood within them. What is the reason for that? The pulmonary veins capacitance has increased because of the negative intrathoracic pressure, which is caused by our inspiration, is what need to be basically understood. This procedure, this phenomena become a little exaggerated in certain specific scenarios. They all lead to development of pulsus paradoxus. So this is the normal blood pressure. Typically at the time of inspiration, generally there is a slight fall. But if there is an increased amount of fall greater than 10 millimeters of mercury in the systolic BP at the time of inspiration, it is called as pulsus paradoxus. Now by principle, what should cause pulsus paradoxus, doctor? Any situation where the left heart is not ready to get filled, even if the veins want to fill it, even if pulmonary veins want to fill it, that also can cause a fall of the systolic BP. So that is the reason, doctor, in myocardial infarction and in the case of the tamponade, etc., which is all leading to the development of a decreased right heart functional reserve, and similarly right ventricular inflow is typically obstructed. For example, if there is any SVC obstruction or pulmonary embolism. Similarly, whenever there is a pulmonary vasodilatation and there is a decreased blood flow into the left heart, for example in asthma or in the COPD or anaphylactic shock, there are all the scenarios which can lead to the development of the pulsus paradoxus. Accordingly, we can divide the causes of pulsus paradoxus into cardiac causes are there, and we have the pulmonary causes are there, and non-pulmonary, non-cardiac causes are also there, which are preventing the filling of the heart, and that is causing a decrease in the cardiac output and the systolic BP. Now let us examine. Cardiac tamponade, pericardial effusion, pulmonary embolism, cardiogenic shock. In all these scenarios, what will happen? Heart cannot get filled. It's not ready to get filled. That causes the development of pulsus paradoxus. Similarly, if there is any tension pneumothorax or asthma or any such scenario, that will cause an exaggeration of this normal phenomena of this negative intrathoracic pressure, leading to the development of a decreased flow of the blood, and that lead to development of pulsus paradoxus. Similarly, if there is any superior vena cava obstruction also, that will also bring less amount of blood into the heart, which also can lead to development of pulsus paradoxus. So the paradox is pulse is not palpable, but heart is still beating because of the fall of the systolic BP at the time of inspiration is the underlying pathology. Now what is hepatorenal syndrome? Very simple. A patient has got ascites, liver failure. You are a treating gastroenterologist. Your resident suddenly said, sir, patient's creatinine also is going up. Urea also is going up. he is developing a rapid renal failure, sir. Then as a busy gastroenterologist on rounds, what will you tell? Naturally, a lot of ascites is there, man. That is the reason probably all the fluid went into extravascular compartment. Intravascularly fluid is very less. Hence, there is a decreased renal perfusion. Probably he is going into acute tubular necrosis. That is the reason he is developing renal failure, is what we generally think. Then your resident will say, sir, renal biopsy was also done. It is totally normal. But urea creatinine is shooting up. So that is a typical scenario called hepatorenal syndrome. Let us talk about it. Patient has got cirrhosis, portal hypertension, moderate to severe ascites in such an individual without any renal pathology, without any histological evidence of the presence of any pathology in the kidney. The development of a rapidly worsening renal failure with a rise of the urea and creatinine with azotemia is called as the hepatorenal syndrome, is what need to be remembered. There are two types of hepatorenal syndrome. The type 1 is very rapid, very progressive, and generally the presence of the spontaneous bacterial peritonitis in the ascitic fluid, if it is there, such a patient with ascites with SBP typically develops a type 1 type of hepatorenal syndrome. Okay? Now, typically around 25% of patients who have got this hepatorenal syndrome are having not only a simple ascites with cirrhosis with portal hypertension, but also they are having spontaneous bacterial peritonitis. And without treatment, these people will be succumbing in less than 2 weeks. Mortality is the rule. Virtually all of these patients die within around 10 weeks of time without treatment. And type 1, when do you define? There is a doubling of the creatinine to more than 2.5 milligram per deciliter in less than 2 weeks. There is the level of rapidity at which the renal dysfunction is seen in those who are having the hepatorenal syndrome of type 1. Then what is hepatorenal syndrome of type 2? Typically they have a moderate and a stable reduction of the GFR, unlike a rapid reduction in type 1. And compared to the type 1 people, type 2 have relatively well preserved hepatic function. And generally, how do you take care of the ascites, etc., doctor? You try to give diuretics, you try to tap, paracentesis, etc. But these people who are developing hepatorenal syndrome have a diuretic resistant ascites, is what need to be basically understood. So the International Society of Nephrology has prescribed major and minor criteria to define the hepatorenal syndrome. Patient should have a chronic or a acute hepatic disease and a liver failure with portal hypertension, is one major criteria. Then the serum creatinine is greater than 1.5 milligrams per deciliter, or a 24-hour creatinine clearance is less than 40 ml per minute. Criteria 2. And there is no shock. Why no shock? If there is a shock, there is a hypoxia to the ischemia to the kidneys, and that lead to acute tubular necrosis, that naturally lead to worsening of the urea and creatinine. Only in the absence of the shock, in the presence of liver dysfunction with portal hypertension, if there is a development of renal failure, then you entertain the diagnosis of hepatorenal syndrome. Why? Because to define hepatorenal syndrome, renal pathology must not show any tubular necrosis or any glomerular pathology, which can otherwise explain all those rise of creatinine and urea. Got it? So absence of shock, absence of any ongoing septicemia, and patient should not be on any nephrotoxic drug or any blood loss or any hypotensive state, which all can predispose equally well as much as that of the hepatorenal syndrome. They also can predispose to azotemia. They all should not be there. You should exclude that they are not there. That's the reason what will your gastroenterologist will say on the rounds? First, rule out other possible causes which are much more common to be responsible for azotemia in a patient who has got an ascites and liver disease. Probably you are giving too much of aminoglycosides to him. Probably the patient is in hypotension, which you are not observing. You rule out all those things. In spite of that, if the patient is having rising urea creatinine, then let us talk about hepatorenal syndrome. And in spite of giving a volume expansion of around 1.5 liters of isotonic saline, there is no improvement of renal function. In which situation will it improve? Suppose if hypotension responsible, tubular necrosis is responsible, in all such scenarios it will improve, but it is not improving. And proteinuria should be less than 500 milligrams per day. It should not be a case of nephrotic syndrome, because suppose if it is a nephrotic syndrome, any nephrotic syndrome patient can go into a rapid renal failure. So you should rule out that also. And there is no ultrasonic evidence of any shrunken kidneys, renal parenchymal disease in the absence of all the possible renal pathology. The presence of a worsening azotemia in a patient of liver disease with a portal hypertension, with ascites, is typically called the hepatorenal syndrome. Then what are the minor criteria to say that there is a renal dysfunction in hepatorenal syndrome? Urine volume less than 500, urine sodium less than 10 milliequivalents per liter. Now why this urine sodium less than 10 milliequivalents per liter is laid as a criteria in hepatorenal syndrome? Basically, if the tubules are damaged in acute tubular necrosis, what happens to the sodium, doctor, in the urine? It becomes increased, because tubules are responsible for concentrating and preventing sodium loss into urine. If they are abnormal, sodium is lost. So one of the most important things before you consider hepatorenal syndrome is there should not be any tubular damage. How do you ensure that? Urine sodium should be less than 10 milliequivalents per liter. Commonly in the ward rounds, the chief likes to know what is the urine sodium of this patient about whom you are thinking a possible hepatorenal syndrome. If the urine sodium report comes greater than 10, don't think of hepatorenal syndrome, is always the rule. And the urine osmolality greater than plasma osmolality. Naturally, when the tubules are functioning, concentrating ability of the urine is good, then naturally urine osmolality must be really greater, which is an indicator of good tubules. And the RBC CAS in the urine must be less than 50 and serum sodium must be less than 130. These are all the indications which are called the minor criteria. So in both the hepatorenal syndrome type 1 and type 2, fundamentally the histopathological changes in the kidney must be absent. Now the question comes, then why patients are developing azotemia in the case of hepatorenal syndrome? Just because they have pathology in the liver, ascites, portal hypertension, then why they are developing the azotemia and renal dysfunction is the question. The main reason is they have a severe renal vasoconstriction. That is the underlying cause, and who is inducing this severe renal vasoconstriction, hepatorenal syndrome? The reason is simple. They have cirrhosis, they have ascites, and because of ascites, what happened? All the intravascular volume has gone into extravascular compartment. That is strongly stimulating the sympathetic nervous system, and this sympathetic nervous system in turn is causing a strong renal vasoconstriction, and that is the reason they are developing this azotemia. So sympathetic nervous system, renal prostaglandins and endothelin, they are the three culprits causing a strong renal vasoconstriction, which is the underlying cause for the renal dysfunction seen in this otherwise liver patients of cirrhosis and portal hypertension, is what need to be remembered. So the renin-angiotensin system, sympathetic nervous system, endothelin, they are the predominant culprits in the development of the pathology. Let us quickly answer our question, doctor. Urine sodium less than 10 milliequivalents per liter, definitely a criteria. And you know why? Because tubules are functioning normally. Normal renal histology should be there. Proteinuria must be less than 500 to rule out that it is not nephrotic syndrome responsible. So these are the things which are the part of the criteria in the case of the hepatorenal syndrome. Now tuberculosis in HIV positive individual. In fact, lung involvement in HIV positivity, it is a Harrison, as much big as a Harrison's textbook, that much a big book for the pulmonology, MD pulmonology people. Let us talk about it. Typically HIV will be atypically presenting. It may not have cavitation, it may not have caseation, it may not have all that granulomatous response which is otherwise seen in an immunocompetent individual is what need to be remembered. It can present like a miliary infiltrate interstitially, it can present like a lymphadenopathy, and sputum AFP will be less frequently positive in a HIV positive individual though he is having tuberculosis is what need to be remembered. And extrapulmonary tuberculosis like TB meningitis, bone TB, etc. are much more common in a HIV positive individual. And MON2 test may be negative because for MON2 you require cell-mediated immunity which is not there in a HIV positive individual. And the reactivation rates are much higher in a HIV positive individual. I will quickly review the 4 common causes for the pneumonia that you come across in a HIV positive individual. As a clinician you must be sure. There is a community acquired pneumonia in a 21-year-old HIV positive individual who has got a CD4 count of 684 which is very less, and she presented with 2 days history of cough, fever, shortness of breath. And when the chest radiograph had been taken, there are multifocal airspace consolidations which you are able to see here, and the gram stain has grown gram positive cocci, and antibiotic therapy brought the remission. So what is the cause, doctor? It is the community acquired pneumonia, bacterial, the most important cause, in fact the most common cause for the pneumonia in the HIV positive individuals. Earlier, maybe 5 years back, if you write entrance, most common cause for the pneumonia in HIV positive is Pneumocystis caarniae pneumonia. But in the modern era what we are doing? The moment HIV is positive, we are starting trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole every day, double strength. So the incidence of pneumocystis has come down, and now our HIV positive patients are having more of community acquired pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia most common cause. Now this is a case of Pneumocystis caarniae pneumonia in a 31-year-old HIV positive with an underlying emphysema. Let us look into it. This PA radiograph is showing symmetrical bilateral perihilar and basilar ground glass epicytes with consolidation. Patient has severe respiratory distress, Pneumocystis caarniae. Type 1 respiratory failure will be there. LDH levels will be high in the serum. And what will you do for him? Put him on oxygen mask, start hydrocortisone. Though he is immunocompromised and HIV positive, don't hesitate. Start him on hydrocortisone. Give a Bactrim DS tablet. They are the minimum things you can do. And still if he is going into worsening of his respiratory distress, intubate him and connect to ventilator. That is the end point. So the high resolution CT of this pneumocystis, you can see the symmetric distribution of the interstitial pneumonia which is typically caused by the pneumocystis is what you are able to see here. Now this is another case of the cystic Pneumocystis caarniae in a 48-year-old HIV positive individual who presented to the casualty with a shortness of breath and cough. You can see the numerous cysts of varying size with a diffuse distribution can be a presenting feature of the Pneumocystis caarniae pneumonia, and this coronal CT is typically showing this patchy foci of consolidation in the left upper lobe. So this is a classical presentation. In which scenario pneumocystis will present this kind of cavity as a presenting feature, doctor? Those who are on the pentamidine inhalation of aerosols. For them this kind of cavity in the apex is a presenting feature in the case of Pneumocystis caarniae. Otherwise it is a diffuse interstitial infiltrate is a presenting feature. Now this is the next case. The patient's chest radiograph shows mediastinal lymphadenopathy and diffuse nodular opacities after discontinuation of the highly active antiretroviral therapy. So this kind of lymphadenopathy can be a presenting feature of the tuberculosis in the case of the HIV positive individual. Now this is a case of 53-year-old HIV positive individual, CD4 count is 49, cough and sputum for the past 4 months, and there are multiple small pulmonary nodules. You are able to see pulmonary nodules are typically seen. So this kind of presentation is a feature of the granulomatous pneumonia which can be caused by the histoplasma. So quickly summarize, doctor. Bacteria, pneumonia is most common, pneumocystis carneae with interstitial infiltrates and cavities sometimes, and the presence of atypical appearance of the TB with lymphadenopathy, etc., or it can be a granulomatous fungal infections which are invasive like the histoplasma. Varied forms HIV positive individual can present to you. Now let us talk about the UMN and LMN lesion, which is a common question asked in the exam. UMN and LMN both will have weakness, but spasticity, Babinski sign positivity, increased deep tendon reflexes, and no atrophy unless it is a chronic UMN. They are all the features of the UMN lesion is what need to be remembered. Now one of the options given here was rigidity. Rigidity is a feature of extrapyramidal pathway, vestibulospinal, tectospinal, rubrospinal, reticulospinal, they are all called extrapyramidal, whereas the corticospinal is called pyramidal. So Parkinson's patients will have basal ganglia problem, they have extrapyramidal problem, not the corticospinal problem. Stroke patient will have corticospinal, pyramidal problem, so he will have spasticity, whereas Parkinson will have rigidity, Huntington's will have rigidity, is what need to be basically remembered. Now let us talk about the Parkinsonism. What are the classical features? Echinacea, rigidity, tremor are the triad, as all of you know very well. And it is what type of tremor, doctor? Pill rolling resting tremor is what you typically come across. Those faces, because of that marked rigidity, Parkinsonism faces. Eye blinking will be very decreased. One of the early features, some elderly man staring at you with a very decreased blinking, think of Parkinsonism. And also that stooped posture while they are walking, and they become frozen, they can't walk through a frame, because that planning which has to be done when you have to walk through a narrow pathway cannot happen if the basal ganglia, which are part of the planning system of the motor activity, are abnormal. So there is a reason they become frozen while walking. Suppose if a small stumble comes in the middle, they reach until there and they don't know how to cross that. That is a problem with the Parkinsonism. And they have a decreased arm swing whenever they are walking, and these are all the important features. Bradykinesia, rigidity, resting tremor, pill rolling, guide disturbances. Sometimes there can be Parkinson plus syndromes. They can develop dementia, Parkinsonism people. If there is a Lewy body disease developing, then dementia plus Parkinsonism can coexist with each other. So depression, anxiety, sleep disturbances, autonomic dysfunction can be coexistent. What is that syndrome called? Parkinsonism with autonomic dysfunction. Shy-Drager's syndrome is the name which is being given for it. They have changes in mood, cognition, behavior, and what are on-off phenomena that you come across in Parkinsonism, doctor? A Parkinsonism individual can have a severe fluctuations which are highly unpredictable. They may have dyskinesia, suddenly they may go into agitation. So this kind of on-off phenomena can be there. So typically how can you take care of them? Epomorphine is one of the options available. Similarly, drug holidays need to be given to overcome it. So these are all the various ways. Now let's go to the next question. Have you heard of WHO criteria for AIDS? Okay, in pediatric AIDS or adult AIDS? Pediatric AIDS, WHO has given certain important criteria. 2 positive tests for HIV infection by ELISA in children older than 18 months, or confirmed maternal infection for children younger than 18 months is one major criteria, and presence of at least 2 major and 2 minor. What are the major criteria, doctor? Loss of weight or failure to thrive, chronic diarrhea for over 1 month, prolonged fever which is for over 1 month. They are all the major signs of pediatric HIV. Then minor signs include repeated common infections, generalized lymphadenopathy, oropharyngeal candidiasis, persistent cough for more than 1 month, and disseminated maculopapular dermatosis. They are all the minor criteria. So that is how the pediatric HIV had been defined by the WHO, and the examiner is fond of asking cough more than 1 month, less than 1 month, etc., which you have to typically answer in the exam correctly. The 1993 AIDS surveillance definition had been given, case definition. Suppose you are working in the field, there must be certain criteria standardized. That's how the surveillance definition came into picture. Now another common question asked is, what are all included in this AIDS surveillance case definition? Any common textbook will give it, at least, but you need to focus on that commonly asked question.